First of all, I think that many people are misled by the term Special Rapporteur for the United Nations, and so in publicity in Canada and elsewhere, people have said, the United Nations has declared that parental alienation should be banned. Special Rapporteurs are not the United Nations. They're people who happen to get someone deep in the bureaucracy in the United Nations appoint someone a Special Rapporteur, and then they write a bunch of reports. And if one looks at reports, many of them are highly controversial. It is grossly misleading to say the United Nations. The United Nations does make decisions. The United Nations has condemned Russia for invading Ukraine. They haven't done anything about it, but at least they've condemned it. The United Nations has not taken a stand on parental alienation, far from it. This one Special Rapporteur, that is her view. She's not a psychologist, she's not a lawyer, she's a journalist. And her views about some other things, if one looks around, are very controversial, about trans children, actually about Palestine, Israel. I mean, she has reviews about it, then she writes them into a report and says, this is happening, and so on. People are critical of her in other areas. But in this area, one of the concerns that I have is reading it, if you want, as a scholar, as a researcher, is she cites Richard Gardner and a little bit about Burnett, and ignores hundreds of people who've written from a different perspective. And in fact, in my view about parental alienation, Gardner did some important seminal work in the 1980s and 1990s. But since then, the field has evolved a great deal, and there's recognition of the limitations of his work. And in my view, there are a number of psychologists, Janet Johnson, Joan Kelly, Barbara Fiedler, who's here at the conference, who have a more nuanced view. And they, on the one hand, very much recognize that parental alienation is an important, valid, useful concept, but also recognize that there are many cases of children rejecting a parent that are not parental alienation. Let's say it's the father has been abusing the child or the mother, and the abuse for a child to reject a parent doesn't have to be, it can be very, coarse, gross, physical abuse or even sexual abuse. But if a parent is emotionally cold with a child, the child may say, you know what, I don't really want to be with that person. If the marriage is intact, they just spend less time with them. But if the parents are separated, they say, you know what, I just don't want to see them. I don't want to see them much or at all. It's a reaction to the conduct of the parent. And it's important to recognize that. But there are also alienation cases. And so people like the Special Rapporteur, Rahim al-Salem, who say parental alienation is just junk science, it should never be used in courts and so on. That's wrong. But it has to be seen as one concept in a more complex and nuanced circumstance. And many of these cases are very complex, and many of the cases involve poor conduct by both parents. Particularly if there's a lot of conflict between parents and they've separated, children tend to choose one side or the other. They're just too difficult to go back and forth. That's, unfortunate, and that doesn't mean nothing can be done about those cases. If the court is there saying, you know what, the child is not seeing one parent, the child is not seeing dad, but he's not abusive, the judge is ordering that the child spend more time with the rejected parent. And maybe if you have the resources, we're ordering some counseling. So there are counselors, certainly in Canada, here in Toronto, there are people who are well trained to help the family restore that relationship. But the counselor, the therapist, ideally is working with both parents and the child. Not all at once, but meeting with everybody and saying, this is a problem of the family. There's tension between mom and dad, and the child is caught in the middle, and the child is taking one side or the other. That's not healthy for the child. And on a certain level, often the parents might be saying, well, I want my child to have a relationship with the other parent, but then they're actually undermining it because they're not fully aware of it. And that's why they need a mental health professional to say, let's sit down with you individually and as a family, see what's going on. Can we help this child to have a healthy relationship with both of you? Everywhere in the world, there are issues, serious issues of women being abused, and in more serious cases, even being murdered by their former partners. But there are also cases where post-separation, there may be an exaggerated claim of abuse. provide shelters for women who've been abused. There are women who are genuinely abused there, and there are also women who say, I don't want to live with him anymore. I can't afford a place to stay. But I can go to the shelter, but I have to say I've been abused. And so there's some manipulation of that. I happen to know those shelter workers have told me this. They need a place to live, but they shouldn't be there because they're saying they're abused. But once they're there and they say they're abused, then they say, oh yeah, well then here it tends to grow. The story tends to grow. And it also influences because women know that that's what they're going to be asked. We have a certain level of unfounded allegations of abuse. I want to say we also have many cases where women are abused and they're not believed by the courts or the police. So they're very challenging cases for police, courts, child protection services. But I think to say, well, women never lie about being abused is not correct. And some women particularly may have been traumatized as children, they may have been sexually assaulted as children themselves, and they separate from their husband, and they say, I believe he's sexually abusing the child. And for example, I mean, she may say, well, when I was living with him, he was watching pornography. And you know, we live in a society in which many men watch pornography, and many women are not aware of that. And now we've separated, I think he's sexually abusing the child, just as I was sexually abused. And it's not because she is consciously lying, but it's unfounded. And so there's a dynamic there, and the huge challenge for the courts and the police and judges to say, is this a true allegation or not? And so that's a significant issue everywhere in the world. So we have an organization in Canada called National Association of Women and the Law. In January of 2024, motivated in part by the report of the Special Rapporteur, remedies, there are a few American states that have enacted legislation, cadence law, that prohibit the courts from using the concept of parental alienation or restrict the kind of evidence or restrict the kind of orders that courts can make that restricts the use of parental alienation evidence. So this group, which is a fairly powerful lobby group, and I want to say NAL does a lot of good, important work representing the interests of women. There are issues, many issues, on which I agree with them. But on this issue, I and many others disagreed with them, and they said, we want to petition Parliament to change the law, change the Divorce Act to ban parental alienation evidence in Canadian family courts. And they had a large number of women's organizations sign this petition. But it turns out if you run a women's organization and somebody says, we women's organizations better stand together, and here are 25 position papers on a whole lot of things, abortion, family violence, equal pay. Oh, and there's one in here, parental alienation, they just sign them all. And so they all sign all the petitions. And I get that's solidarity, and that's how it works. But I happen to know that some of the organizations that signed it really weren't particularly familiar with the issue at all, but they signed up. So it sounded great. We have 250 organizations. Parliament in Canada has to do something. And they were lobbying politicians in the Department of Justice. And then there was a sort of a counter effort, and I was a number of people involved in writing and phoning and saying, this would be a mistake for Canada to ban the use of parental alienation. It's an important concept, certainly, and I want to emphasize, there are cases I mentioned, unfounded allegations of domestic violence, unfounded allegations of child abuse. There are also unfounded allegations of parental alienation. So they're very challenging how the courts try to ascertain the truth. Each case must be looked at on its own evidence. We were, myself and others, were successful in persuading the government to do the right thing, which is to say, in Canada, if there's an allegation of parental alienation, it goes to the courts. We still have, many challenging issues, but at least we don't have that law, which I consider to be arbitrary, contrary to the scientific evidence, and contrary to the interests of children. In Canada, when an allegation of parental alienation is made, often it's not proven. Doesn't mean that it didn't happen, but it's a fairly high standard to show that the child is actually alienated. Often parents say bad things about the other parent, but doesn't result in alienation. But if it's proven, if the judge said, I believe that the child has been alienated, largely, by the way, the judges are very much influenced by expert evidence. So a psychologist appointed by the court has met the child, has seen the child interact with the parents, read various reports, done psychological testing. So it's a quite elaborate process for an expert to conclude that there's been alienation. And the expert's opinion is not determinative, but it often has significant weight. There may be evidence from the police. There may be evidence from child protection workers, from teachers. One of the things that our research points out is in about a third of cases, it's the mother who is the rejected or alienated parent. So although it is more often the father who's rejected, the courts can do a number of different things. The most dramatic and intrusive is what we call custody reversal. That is, say, the child has been living primarily, or by the end of the case, totally with the mother who's saying, my child doesn't want to see the other parent and I'm protecting my child or whatever. And the judge says, I don't accept that. And in those circumstances, one of the things that Canadian and other courts may do is say, I, the judge, am ordering this child to go to live from living with the mother to live with the father and not see the alienating mother for 3 months or 6 months or whatever. And also do a 10-day program like Dr. Parnell puts on, Family Bridges, which will help the child transition and understand what happened. Because the mother is so clearly undermining that relationship, if I say, oh, go and see your father half the time or every second weekend, it won't happen, because the mother will keep on undermining it. That is an important remedy, but actually more commonly the judge will say, I'm concerned about this situation. The child was supposed to see their father every second weekend, but it wasn't happening. I'm going to say the child is going to spend alternate weeks, more time with the rejected parent. So now it's going to be a week on, a week off. And it turns out for less severe cases that might help. And I should say that other cases where the judge says, this child is 15 years old, I don't think I can make any order effectively at all. That the child is so entrenched, I hope things get better. Some children, especially when they're in the midst of their adolescence, so they're already in an adolescent rebellion stage, it may be very hard to get them to change, but things may improve in 3 or 4 when they're 18 or 22. They'll realize, even without seeing a psychologist, you know what, I think I have good memories of this parent. And now that as I get older, I'm living on my own or away at university or working or whatever, I realize that that was wrong, and they phone up the parent, they get back together. It may be 3 or 4 years before you see your child, or maybe never, we don't know, but it at least gives the parent hope. I think it's important for the legal system, because one of the things that judges that often happen in these cases, here's the message, the child's going to spend more time, 1 week with each parent, week about, and I want to tell you right now, Mom, this has got to change, because if you don't, you're going to lose your child altogether. That's by far the biggest and most effective threat. And it also says, I care about the child's best interest, and if you can't share custody, it's in your child's best interest to just be with dad. But the best thing is, you both spend a week with the child. There are false allegations of child abuse, there are false allegations of domestic violence, and there are false allegations of parental alienation. And false, sometimes people are deliberately lying, sometimes they're mistaken. If we're talking about what was going on when the parents were together, they actually have different memories. Does that happen? Yes. And that's the huge challenge of the family courts everywhere. That if everyone's telling the truth, it'll be much easier. To me, family law is one of the most interesting areas of law, because it actually, on a lot of issues, has a lot of technical complexity. So, people are talking about evidence, what is admissible evidence, so on, many complex issues. But this also has the human and the emotional side that makes it an endlessly fascinating area. One of the interesting and things about alienation, other things is you can say, so how long did it take you to realize that your relationship, there are people who say, my former spouse, gets up on the court and is lying to the judge. Why doesn't the judge realize they're lying? And sort of as an academic observer, one might say, well, how long did you live with them before you realized that they lie a lot? Judges spend a lot of their time what we call conferencing. So the people come into court and they say, I'm angry about this and upset about this and concerned about this. And the judge listens and says, you could have a trial, but it's going to take you 2 years to have a trial here in this jurisdiction. But maybe you can settle. I can see that you both love your child. You don't agree, but maybe you can see a mediator, or maybe you can go away and think about this and come back in a couple of months and maybe you can negotiate a settlement. And meanwhile, read about parental alienation and think about why that's a situation you want to avoid, because it's not in the interest of your child. But the lawyers for the parents should know that they have a responsibility to help the parents be better parents in the context of parental separation. They're not counselors, they're not educators fully, but part of their role is to say, okay, we have to figure out what you can do with your property, what you can do with support, but part of what you have to do as a separating parent is develop a healthy relationship with this person who you once loved and now for a variety of reasons are no longer in a good relationship with. And how are you going to have a healthy relationship as regards the child? Because you're going to have this relationship for the rest of your lives. Are you both going to be at the wedding? Is that what you want? Yes, we both want to be there. Well, how are you going to talk? Are there going to be grandchildren? Are they going to see you all? Well, yes, so we got to work towards that in a positive, constructive way.